About 40% of children in the United States live in states where school messages are routinely sent, either as a public education best practice or mandated by law. What are these messages about? Body mass index. Today, we are talking about whether measuring a child's weight in schools actually helps them. I've invited Dr. Kristine Madsen on the show today. She's an associate professor at UC Berkeley School of Public Health and the faculty director for the Berkeley Food Institute. She's a pediatrician and research scientist with expertise in the design and evaluation of interventions related to cardiovascular risk in youth and health inequities. Her research is focused on identifying policies and programs that will improve the nutrition and physical activity environments for youth and their families and reduce health inequities. She recently published a study called Effect of School-Based Body Mass Index Reporting in California Public Schools, which was a randomized clinical trial, and this article appeared in JAMA Pediatrics. I'm including the link to the research study in the show notes for you. Today we're going to chat about the body mass index measurement, her study findings, health disparities in children, and what we really need to focus on in schools. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Welcome back, everyone. This is episode number 127. I'm Jill Castle, your host, and you're listening to the Nourished Child Podcast. Today, you can find the links to everything we discuss with Dr. Madsen in the show notes over at jillcastle.com/127. And I'll just ask you now instead of later, go ahead and subscribe to the show if you haven't already. It is the best way to get all the new releases. And I have two quick updates. The Smart Mom's Guide to Healthy Snacking is finally available on Amazon and in bookstores and libraries. Woohoo! Let the Smart Mom's Guide to Healthy Snacking help you raise a smart snacker, one who makes healthy snack choices, tunes in to their appetite and other body signals, and grows up to be autonomous with snacking. My other announcement is I'm back on YouTube. I'm actually making new videos on YouTube, and this is the year of yes to YouTube. You can head over to my channel. It's called Jill Castle, and check out the videos I have up there so far. I'm just doing one per week, and I actually am going to ask you for help. I need your help to build my reach. You can do that by hitting the like button when you watch a video or subscribing to the channel. Thanks for helping me out. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast.
Thanks so much, Jill. It's nice to be here.
I am excited to have you here on the show to talk about BMI as measured in schools. And I noticed your research in an article. I'm blanking on where I saw it now. I think it might have been CNN. But this is a hot topic for parents, professionals who are working with children. And I'm just curious how you first got into this work and what is it that drew you to doing a study on this topic?
So when we think about how to help kids be healthy, and particularly from sort of the perspective of cardiovascular risk, and I'll talk about cardiovascular risk here because when we measure a child's weight, what we're really trying to do is trying to assess how likely they are to go on to develop diabetes or go on to have, high blood pressure or some of those things where weight's a marker of that, but weight is not the problem itself. And so we use weight as a proxy. And when a kid comes into clinic, I'm a pediatrician and had a clinical practice seeing kids who actually were overweight. And when they come into practice, what you're trying to do is, figure out what can I do to make sure that you're going to be healthy long term. And again, weight is just a proxy for that. So the best place to have those kinds of discussions is obviously with your physician, with someone who is very scientific and kind of knows about the risks and knows about you, and you have kind of a trusting relationship. But because kids often don't see their doctors, sometimes for many years at a time if they're healthy, there was a recommendation that schools should be weighing kids, not because schools are the right place to weigh kids, but because otherwise they might get missed.
Mm-hmm.
So schools began doing this, and it's often done as part of an overall physical fitness test. It's not necessarily just weighing the kids, although Arkansas did a huge statewide experiment where they were really just weighing the kids and sending home BMI report cards. So that's a way to let parents know that their child may be at risk. The problem is when you're doing it in the school setting, it could potentially have cause some harm to kids. It can be very embarrassing. It's a little awkward to have someone see you being weighed or to have someone know how much you weigh. And so we were trying to figure out, does sending home reports, about a child's weight status to parents from schools, does that actually help? Does that lead to a reduction in pediatric obesity? And B, might it cause some harm overall? And when we talk about harm, the big concern is that if a student becomes more embarrassed about their weight or feels, less satisfaction with their weight, there is some relationship between those feelings, feeling bad about yourself, feeling bad particularly about your weight or your size, and the likelihood of kind of going on to having eating behaviors that are really unhealthy, or what we call disordered eating behaviors. So that was kind of why we started it out. We just wanted to know. Nobody knew whether or not they were effective in reducing pediatric obesity, sending these reports home. And nobody really knew if they were causing harm, although there was a lot of concern, on the parts of many parents and physicians that they might be causing harm.
Yeah, yeah. I know that, I've been a blogger since 2009, and I'm a pediatric dietitian. I've worked in private practice and in hospitals in the past. And I started seeing a lot of discord about the use of BMI in schools back in, I want to say 2011 or 2012, where parents were reporting just angriness over the fact that they got a letter from their school stating that their child was overweight or the BMI was high. So what also, I guess, and we'll talk a little bit more about body dissatisfaction and the findings of your study, but what are you finding also from a parenting standpoint? How are parents feeling about getting these report cards?
It's so interesting that you remember the news back that was Massachusetts, because they launched a report card, and unfortunately they used the term obese. So they actually had a scale saying your child is obese, or your child is overweight, or your child is, normal weight. And we recognize that the term obese is really distressing to many parents, particularly if their child is overweight. It's scary, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to take action. In fact, it may really turn them off. So a lot of the stuff, and there were, some things carried on national news segment about just what you're saying, that parents were really angry. And I honestly think one of the problems was they must not have talked to any parents about that. Because if they had talked to any set of parents would have said, well, don't use the term obese. And so what we did in our study was we just used the term overweight when a child's BMI was above the 95th percentile. And so basically when we're trying to decide if a child may be at risk for, developing disease later on, we use data that was collected in the United States prior to 1980, before our country was really having this problem with a high prevalence of overweight. So back before 1980, when we collected these data, and we did this nationally, this is a national health and nutrition study that was done, and it's done every couple of years. It continues to be done. But what they did is they said, okay, the kids who are in the top 5% for weight, we're going to say that those are the kids that are most at risk. So it's that group that we used. But today, even though back in the 1980s, only 5% of kids had a weight that was really concerning, today, depending on the population that we're talking about, you can have as many as 20% of kids in that particular category. So just to be clear, the way that parents typically feel about this, it's a lot about how you convey that message. which is why,
Mm-hmm.
I started by saying, great place to have a conversation is in a pediatrician's office, or right
Yeah.
with with a pediatric dietitian, with someone who is a healthcare provider and kind of, knows how to have those really thoughtful discussions. Parents do not like the term obese unless, and this, I'll call this out. When we did focus groups with a lot of parents, and we chose parents with different backgrounds, different race, ethnic backgrounds, and parents of children who didn't have weight problems were very happy using the term obese. And there was a little bit of shaming going on. And some of those parents were like, well, those parents, the other parent, the parent who has a child who, has overweight, those parents should know their kid's obese. And so I think we need to be really careful about the shaming that we do, because we don't realize how much of, your weight status really is driven by genetics. And a
Mm.
large chunk of it is. So if you're a lucky person who happens to either yourself not have to worry that much about your weight, or you got lucky and your kids don't worry, it's not all you, right? It's not all what you do. Some of it's genes as well.
Right, right. I actually did a show not too long ago with Ted Kyle of Conscious Health, and he stated that the obesity gene is responsible for 70% of the risk of obesity. 70% genetic
Yeah.
connection, which I thought,
Yeah.
wow, that is, I don't think people recognize that. That's a
It,
very high
It's
number.
really high. And if you're a highly resourced parent, so you were, fortunate to have a really good education, you have enough money that you can choose whatever food you want to bring into the house for your kids, and you got, and you got unlucky and you've got bad genes in the family that are, increase your risk for disease or increase your risk for overweight, you're going to fight a lot harder than a parent who doesn't have to think about it, but you have all those resources at your side. So now let's
Mhm.
say that you're a single parent who's working two jobs, which, lots of us, 50% of marriages end in divorce. There's a lot of people who are kind of on their own and they're exhausted and they're coming home and they have no money. And the easiest thing to do to keep their kids happy and to fill everybody's tummies is to give them food that's kind of crap,
Mhm. That they can afford.
that they
Yeah,
can
that's
afford,
fast.
that's
Mhm.
filling, and that tastes good, because you can't waste. That's the other thing, right? Think about the number of times that we offer our kids the thing that they don't really want. And we're okay if they don't eat it all. We want to get them accustomed to that taste. That's not something we have. That's a luxury, right? The luxury to say it's okay if you're not going to eat that.
Right. Yeah, it is a luxury. You don't have to eat it is a luxury. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Now, for parents who might be wondering about BMI, can you just quickly break down, what that measurement is? I know weight, but it is in relationship to height. And then also sort of speak to how strong the research is behind it being a connector to risk of health problems.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, BMI, body mass index, we recognize that, if you're someone who is taller, you're going to weigh more. You have to have more lean muscle mass on you. You just got a bigger skeletal frame, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when we come up with, so just taking a kid at a certain age and looking only at their weight does not tell me whether or not that's appropriate for their size. And so it's just a ratio of your weight to your height, basically. I mean, it's a little fancy. It's, weight in kilograms over height in meters squared. Not important. What's important is that it's an index that takes your height into account when it says, okay, is your weight about right for your height? And we have different graphs, one for girls and one for boys, where we can plot out where they fall for a typical girl of their age. And this is obviously, I'm using the binary, either girl or boy, but that's what the charts are. Those are the charts that we have today. So I can say, if you're an 8.5-year-old girl, I can plot you and I can say, okay, what percentile are you at? And this goes back to those data I talked about before, right? Where the data were collected before 1980, and it kind of just shows the range of where most kids fell. So when I use that above the fifth percentile, so at the top 5% of kids, what we do know is in that top 5% of kids, and today, again, that's somewhere between, 10 and 20% of kids fall into that range, depending on your genes and your environment and where you are. But
Mm-hmm.
those kids, there is a very strong correlation between being in that risk group and going on to have other problems in adult life. And in fact, I think something like 60% of those kids already have either pre-hypertension or elevated lipids, like higher cholesterol. So
Mm-hmm.
we know that there's risk. But I think the problem is in the report cards that got sent home, for example, in Massachusetts, where they labeled that top 5% obese, they actually labeled the next category down, which is kids who fell between the 85th and 95th percentiles for weight. They labeled that category overweight. That category, it's really hard to say. About 50% of those kids are going to be misclassified because when you say overweight, you're saying they do way too much for their frame. And the way that we decide whether or not it's accurate is we actually look at body fat. So when you take those kids who are in that overweight category, and again, it's a little confusing because I use the term overweight in the reports that were sent home to parents for kids who were in the top risk group. But in that next risk group down, half of those kids do not have extra body fat. They're just, literally they've got a bigger frame. And then maybe half of them do have a little extra body fat, but it's not until we get into that, that top risk group where the association is very clear.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today. So you didn't call that top group, you didn't use the term obese, you used the term overweight.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, again, based on many focus groups with parents from different backgrounds, asking them, what's the best way to talk about risk? How would you want to hear about it? What should we, what terms should we use? What kind of advice should we give you? And so we constructed the report to be as parent-friendly and parent-centric as possible.
So this is interesting because the focus group, they said they did not like the word obese, but they were okay with the word overweight, I assume.
Yes.
How did they want you to speak to them about their child's health?
Well, so many of them did say that if they got a report that said that their child was overweight, they would go to the doctor, which honestly is what you want. If you really have worries about your child, that's, you're going to get very good advice from your doctor or from a dietitian. Often a doctor will refer you to a dietitian, as I'm sure you know. I'm sure you've had many referrals from healthcare providers. So they wanted to have a conversation with someone they trusted. They spent a lot of time just talking about how hard it was to kind of keep kids healthy today. They had concerns about the food that was served in schools. And they talked too about the pressures and the time constraints that we face as parents and how, sometimes it is easier to just pick up a pizza on the way home rather than trying to cook when they get home. So I think that there was a lot of acknowledgement around how things have changed over time, the pressures that parents face. And they actually expressed an interest in getting this information. I don't think we had many parents who were totally opposed to it. I think that it was really more around how you framed it and whether or not there were suggestions for what you could do about it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great data because, when you're thinking about communicating with families about such a sensitive topic, it's important to understand what really resonates with them. And because if you're turning them off from the get-go, you're not making progress in helping.
Exactly. Right. I'm sure when you meet with parents, when you have a good connection and those few times when it's just, you're not, it's on the same in the same playing field or whatever. And that's really hard, right? It's hard if they've already been turned off or if they're just not open.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's walk through your study a little bit, and you don't have to get too granular with it, but you did look at kids in grades 3 through 8 and over 26,000 of them. So you had a great pool of candidates. Tell us what you found and
right.
Yeah.
So to kind of figure out what So there's two things we were interested in. One was, does sending home those reports actually help? Does it lead to kids, fewer kids being at risk? And then two was, does being weighed at school, is that distressing? So the study, we actually had three different groups. There were kids who were weighed at school and had a report sent home to their parents. And there were kids who were weighed at school but didn't have the report sent home. And then we had a third group that we kind of call our real control group. They did not even get weighed at school because we wanted to see how they felt over time. So all kids took a survey every year. And then, kids in two groups got weighed each year. And so the survey was where we were able to ask, how satisfied are you with your weight, with your shape, your body size? How often do kids talk about weight? How often are you teased about your weight? Or how often are other kids teased about? So we tried to ask questions in ways that would, really elicit honest responses from kids. We also asked how often they dieted, which we know dieting in kids is a bad idea. It does not help them lose weight. That's not the right approach for kids. So we asked how often they dieted, which we consider an unhealthy eating behavior. And we asked how often they skipped meals, which is also not a healthy eating behavior. And when we compared the kids who received a BMI report, right, whose parents got a BMI report, to the kids whose parents didn't get a BMI report, and we looked at how their weight changed over time, there's no difference. Sending that report home to parents did not do anything to change kids' weight status. It was basically, it's just the same in both groups over time. So that's really, really important because there have been some studies that have come out in the last few years that have also found that BMI reports weren't helpful, but none of them were randomized. They didn't use like the best kind of experimental approach. The study structure wasn't as strong as this. And many of them, almost all of them, use the term obese in the report. And just like you were saying, you don't want to turn the parent off. We felt it was very important to do this study with the best possible report that we could come up with. So this says that even under the best circumstances where you've done a report, and by the way, we sent the report home in English, in Spanish, and actually in Chinese as well, which, it's Mandarin and Cantonese, depending on what the school's typical practices were. And by the way, this was in 79 schools all across the state of California with a really diverse group of kids from a socioeconomic background perspective and race ethnic perspective as well. So best possible report, really diverse group of kids, no difference. So sending reports home is not something that schools should invest in. It's not helping because that's the only purpose really, right? Is to try and get them healthier. And if you're not getting them healthier, then what's the point?
Right.
So that was important. And our recommendation is obviously don't waste your resources, schools. That's not where you should be investing. Invest in, healthier school meals and more opportunities for physical activity. And then in terms of the potential for unintended consequences, so for kids feeling worse about themselves, being teased more, or, there being more talk about weight, the results were really mixed, surprisingly, because for many of my colleagues, particularly colleagues who work in the area of eating disorders, so they work with kids who've had anorexia or bulimia, those kids who come into their clinic will often talk about being weighed at school as being a really uncomfortable experience. And they really felt like being weighed at school is causing these eating disorders. And what our study suggests is that probably being weighed at school is not causing those disorders. But if you are already distressed about your weight status, you are going to be very uncomfortable being weighed at school. And that's exactly what we found. When we looked at whether or not kids were bothered by being weighed at school, 2/3 of kids did not care. However, when we looked among kids who described themselves as being overweight, far more kids were uncomfortable with it. So the heavier the student was, but it's actually more important. It's not just being heavy, it's actually being dissatisfied. So there were a lot of kids who were pretty heavy, who were happy with their weight, who weren't bothered by being weighed at school. And honestly, I was surprised because I too have worried about this, and I have a lot of colleagues who have worried about this, but I think it's not done with a lot of privacy. Most of the time, other kids can see them being weighed. that alone we should change. We need to make it, if you're going to do it in schools, you should do it privately. And then if you're going to do it in schools, you have to know, so what's the point of it? Why would we continue the practice?
Yeah.
And the problem, I think, is when we want to figure out where we need to be investing our resources, where's the greatest need in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease or risk for, any kind of concerns we have from a public health perspective, and we want to know where to invest resources. If you don't have the data at a kind of granular level, if you don't have the data at a community level, how do we know who should get those resources? And so I think, there are certainly, I have a lot of colleagues who feel like we absolutely have to keep doing this. We have to keep weighing kids in school because we need to know where the problem lies.
But I guess I have two follow-up questions for you. Did you find that children who were maybe on the thinner side, smaller, more petite, were they bothered, or did you tease out for that at all?
Oh, that's such a good question. I
only ask from personal experience.
Yeah.
Because I was weighed in high school and I happened to be one of the smaller persons. And I remember just feeling very embarrassed that I hadn't developed yet and I was the smallest. And so I was curious from that angle.
You're right. And I can't give you the exact numbers, but it was what we call in statistics a U-shaped curve, meaning there was more distress among those who were underweight, less distress among those who felt, those who felt themselves to be underweight, there was more distress. And those who felt themselves to be overweight, there was more distress. And everybody else was kind of okay with it. So you're right. It does call out both ends of the spectrum. And for boys, more so than girls, that getting their height measured can be uncomfortable, actually. If they're also slow to grow, or if they're just going to be shorter than kind of the typical guy, they may actually feel some embarrassment around that. And you can't protect kids. We shouldn't try to protect kids from everything, and you can't protect them from everything. So you're always trying to weigh what are the benefits of this particular practice and what are the potential harms.
Mm-hmm. I guess my second question too is, Chris, is there a better tool for defining those children who could benefit from public health interventions? Is there something better than BMI that we should be looking at?
Well, yeah, it's fitness, really. I mean, and this is one of the things, and I'm sure you talk about this in your practice as well, but you can be healthy at any size. And, you can be skinny and get diabetes, and you can be heavy and be really healthy. So what we need to be doing is we need to be focusing on kids' fitness and on changing the food environment. So rather than individualizing these issues and saying to a particular child, you're heavy, the food environment around schools should be cleaner. And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is soda taxes. There are 7 in the United States right now, and they don't tax people. It's just a tax on the product itself. So any seller, any distributor of soft drinks, of, sugar sweetened beverages, pays the local city some additional fee. In most cities, it's like 1 cent per ounce, because we recognize that sugar sweetened beverages actually do cause obesity. Sugar sweetened beverages are the number one source of added sugar in our diets, and added sugars are strongly linked to diabetes and early mortality, So if we have things where we know they're harmful, allowing people to sell them really cheaply makes zero sense to me. That's not how we do anything, right? We want to make sure that whatever the real cost of the product is, we want to make sure that's embodied in the actual price of that product. So people are aware when they're going to shop, oh, this thing is problematic. This is not so good for me. And then this thing is the healthy thing. And there are plenty of countries that do that. They actually use prices to make sure that people understand what's healthy versus not healthy. So the fact that we have junk food and sugar sweetened beverages that have really long shelf lives, so they're cheap to make and you can keep them around forever. That's the go-to product, right? They're cheap and they're tasty. It's really, really hard for people to eat healthy when the default cheap food that's everywhere is actually really bad for you. So I think cleaning up the environment is really important. And then in schools, focusing on fitness. Now, the problem right now in schools is that the kinds of fitness assessments we do they're not great. One is a mile run, which is a lot for a lot of kids. If they're not in shape, that's really hard to do. And that can be embarrassing as well. And the other is sort of is a pacer test. I don't know if you ever see, you run between cones and it gets faster and faster and you have to drop out when you can't do it. There are tests like step tests where you step and then you actually just measure someone's change in heart rate. That's just as good a measure of fitness, if not better, because it's not effort dependent and it's not embarrassing. Everybody does it. It's not too hard for almost anybody to do. It's just a measure of how much your body has to get, work harder, which you measure by heart rate. So if you're really fit and you do a lot of walking, your heart rate may not go up much at all. And if you're not that fit, it'll go up a lot. And that's a great way of measuring. I think we're moving closer with iPhones or cellular phones that can measure your heart rate. We're getting closer to being able to do that, but it does take technology and that is a little more expensive. But honestly, that's where I'd love to see us go, because if we're using fitness as the marker for someone's health rather than their weight, we get rid of all that stigma, right, around what you weigh or around your body size.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like it, I think about all the weighing and the measuring and whether that's, a school's business, we're getting a little bit on the not political side, but just kind of thinking of the social aspects of it. Is it even their business to be measuring those very personal measurements, but also is it a good use of staff and funding? So it's interesting to think about the fitness aspect of it. And that really kind of opens up that whole can of worms of when you get into high school, you don't even do fitness classes, really. I think you do them your freshman year in a lot of states, or at least that's been the case for my children. Fitness gets sort of weeded out, as does recess in middle school. And so the emphasis on fitness is really changed over the last decades, I think, and has been minimized. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. And on the topic of schools, I don't know if you've seen or have read there was an article in the New York Times about during this period of COVID where teachers are teaching online and children are, schooling from home. There was an article that came out about schools teaching children to diet, especially where, COVID lockdown has enabled a lot of parents to be able to witness what's being taught to their children in the realm of health classes and physical fitness classes. So I guess my question for you is, between BMI measurements and food and nutrition messaging in school and what's getting, what the topics of education are around health, do we need an overhaul in this area? Are we slipping down a slippery slope? Are we crossing lines? Where can schools be really helpful? And how can we empower schools to be more helpful? And where do we need to maybe say, this is not really the role of a school?
These are such good questions. I do think that a lot of the nutrition education that we do is kind of older school public health, old school public health, where we really focused on the individual's behavior. And I think what we've come to realize over the last, I think in mainstream media over the last decade, social determinants of health have really gained traction as we've come to understand that your access to healthcare and the kind of healthcare you receive is really only predicts about 20% of your health. The rest of your health is predicted by where you live, right? Your zip code, what's available in that, how much money you make, all of these other things that are often beyond a person's control due to either where they've come from, the color of their skin, their ability to, put themselves through college. So lots of things that stop people in their tracks. We continue to educate in schools the way we used to, thinking that it's all up to you. Anybody can do anything. And frankly, if you're not starting with a level playing field, not everybody can get to the same place. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that playing field is genetics, right? And so if you're giving the same message to a kid who's born skinny and a kid who's destined to become heavy, that's not ideal. And I like the idea of rethinking what can schools do. I love a focus on wellness. And I also think it's really important to empower students. Students as agents of change, students as the sort of the investigators kind of their own experience. What is it that students can, and this probably only becomes relevant in high school, but where can we begin to help students in creating a culture of health in their schools? And I certainly don't have those answers, but I think thinking about wellness overall wellness and students as agents of change, that's probably where I could get excited about, thinking, what does that next sort of iteration of health education look like in schools?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that's ripe for change, ripe for renovation, if you will. And I love how you called it old school public health. I think
Yeah.
there's some truth to that. As a pediatrician, I'm curious as to where you see the future role of other pediatricians in this scenario of children with increasing health risks at younger ages. I'll leave the label of weight status off of it, but really kind of keep it a little bit broader. What is the role, and how can pediatricians be, more proactive in prevention mechanisms?
Well, and this kind of goes back to that individual level focus versus more of an environmental focus. And honestly, I think our role as advocates for healthy neighborhoods is critical. Sort of speaking our mind about what we think a healthy environment should, like, what's the ideal environment? And obviously, the changes to school meals that have come out over the last, since 2010 have been really important in ensuring that in general school meals are healthier, and most importantly that we're not selling junk food in schools. There are now new recommendations so that schools are healthy zones in terms of food. And I know, there are a lot of questions about where personal choice is. I mean, I think personal choice is really important. I am a strong believer of everything in moderation. However, kids are not able to distinguish between what's an advertisement and what's a fact. So advertising in schools, not okay. Frankly, I don't think we should be advertising to children, period. They are not the consumer. The consumer should be the parent, right? Kids should not be whining and nagging. I'm sure you've seen all the stuff about the whining and the nagging. So let's be really thoughtful about how we advertise, what we teach kids, what is the education we're providing. Because I will tell you that most of the education that kids get is ads. They see 1,000 ads a day through various, like tons of different mechanisms, but it's amazing how many ads we're exposed to. So we're just pretending if we're thinking that they actually get the education they need around what's healthy and what's not. Mm-hmm. So I think that we as pediatricians need to be outspoken as advocates for protecting our children and making sure that we are creating the very best environment for them to thrive in.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to see a lot of the negative education go away. I'd love to see don't eat this, don't eat that. Obviously there are, in conjunction with what you said, advertising and making unhealthy foods really hard to get. But I'd like to see more positive messaging around food, more adventure, more enjoyment, and not the good food, bad food sort of scenario, but really focusing and helping children enjoy their bodies, enjoy their food, enjoy their activity and their social connections, and just more focused on positivity. And I'm always sort of, as a professional, struggling with this idea for children around prevention versus treatment, and particularly when it comes to weight status. And there's not a lot of difference. And I'm interested in your take on this, but I don't, as a professional, feel there's a whole lot of difference between treatment and prevention when it comes to weight. We're not putting kids on diets as a treatment. We are encouraging all the good things: adequate sleep, physical activity, healthy, balanced, nutritious diets, enjoyment, self-regulation, good parenting around food. I don't know. What are your thoughts about?
I totally agree. I actually think that's really well said. It's all about prevention at this age. It's all about prevention. Even if if it's a kid who's got overweight, still it's about prevention, right? So I think, and I do love I love the idea around positivity. That's super important. We know that's far more motivating. All those positive messages are more motivating. The problem then is you do have to remove those messages that are encouraging them to eat things that are bad for them, right? So I'm not going to have to do counter advertising saying don't eat that if I'm not contesting, right? If I'm not countering someone else's argument that I know is really bad. And I'll tell you, there's lots of countries already that have where you can't advertise products to children because they've just said, they're not the same kind of consumer. You can advertise to adults. That's fine. Adults can make their own decisions. Kids, they can't distinguish in the same way. So I think if we could do that, then we come from a place of really allowing a much, healthier discussion about different things, but without these seeds being planted in kids' heads about what the fun thing is to eat or the right thing is to eat.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Well, I enjoy so much hearing about your study, and I would love for you to, share with parents and professionals who are listening out there what you really want them to know about BMI and how they can sort of process that in their own minds or with their own children, if in fact they are receiving letters at home or have had a child who had a negative experience with being weighed at school. What would you want to say to them?
So if you are a parent who's still receiving BMI reports, you can actually go to the vitstudy.org. That's our website, and download the research brief. Share it with your school. Tell them there's no point in sending reports home. That reports are not helpful and they may cause some harm. And if your schools are weighing children and you have concerns about that as well, you can certainly, lobby them not to. At a minimum, it needs to be done privately. So we know that kids who get weighed in a nurse's office have no problem with that. And if those data around, kids' weight are being used in a way that really are helpful, great. Let's just do it privately so that it doesn't cause any harm.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your expertise. And where can people connect with you if they want to reach out to you?
So I'm an associate professor at UC Berkeley. And if you just Google Kristine Madsen, Kristine is with a K and Madsen's Madsen, I'm very easy to find. My email is easy to find, and I've got a website so you can look me up that way.
Wonderful. And you hailed from Indiana University, is that right?
I went to med school in Indiana, yes.
I graduated from Indiana also.
Oh, I love that state. Beautiful state.
Yeah. All right. Wonderful. I will include the links to your website and all your study and everything in the show notes. And again, I appreciate you being here. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Jill. It was really fun. You're totally on top of your stuff. I love it.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Well, there you have it, folks. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you got a lot out of this interview. I actually really enjoyed interviewing Dr. Madsen. I think she is very reasonable. And her research study, I encourage you to go read it. And if you're not a healthcare provider, head over to her website, thefitstudy.org. That link is in the show notes as well. She is getting a lot of numbers behind her research. So her data is really strong and her study design is strong as well. So head over there and you can check out more about BMIs in school, and you can look at her research around soda tax and how that's having an impact on the environment for children as well. Thanks again for listening and for tuning in. I really appreciate it. We are cresting 350,000 downloads, coming up to my 128th show after this one. And I can tell you some of the upcoming guests I think you'll be really excited about. I'm going to have Sharon Donovan on the show soon. She'll come in. She was one of the leads on the birth to 24 month addition to the dietary guidelines that have recently come out in 2020. So we'll have an interesting conversation together. And in the meantime, hug that child in your life, give them a nice, strong, firm squeeze, and let them know how much you love them. And we'll talk to you real soon. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.